The chandeliers of the Hall of Mirrors were first lit in 1684, when Jules Hardouin-Mansart's long gallery was completed at the Palace of Versailles in the town of Versailles outside Paris. This morning they glow at half power. A cleaner's cart squeaks across the parquet, velvet ropes hang in soft arcs between gilt candelabra. Beyond the mirrors, the gardens are a pale reflection in the glass. On a marble pilaster, a discreet plaque recalls another transformation. In 1837, Louis-Philippe inaugurated here a museum of the history of France, dedicated, as the inscriptions say, to all the glories of France. The palace that once staged absolutist power is now a carefully routed circuit, its routes calibrated to visitor flow. A single crystal drop on the nearest chandelier catches the light of an opening door. The first tour group enters, headphones ready, tickets scanned, gift bags folded beneath their arms. The room still performs magnificence. What has vanished is the power it was built to declare. One day, even this performance of preservation will be only an archive of how we visited the past. In the spring of 1684, the western wing of the Palace of Versailles stood complete at last, its long gallery stretching 73 meters through the first floor of the chateau, overlooking gardens that had been drained, leveled, and planted according to André Lenotre's geometries. The Hall of Mirrors, so named for the 357 mirror panes set into 17 arched panels along the interior wall, faced 17 tall windows that opened toward the west, toward the parterres and fountains in the distant horizon where the sun descended each evening. Jules Hardouin-Mansart, the king's principal architect, had overseen the transformation of an open terrace into an enclosed promenade, collaborating with the painter Charles Lebrun, who designed the vault decorations celebrating the military and diplomatic triumphs of Louis XIV's early reign. The ceiling paintings depicted battles won, treaties signed, cities fortified, narrative panels framed by gilded stucco and surrounded by allegorical figures representing the virtues and powers of the French crown. The hall was not merely decorative. It functioned as a passage between the king's state apartment in the south and the queen's apartment in the north, and as a ceremonial space where courtiers gathered during the day, seeking audience, negotiating favor, or simply being seen in proximity to royal authority. Access to the king was a form of currency in this world, and the Hall of Mirrors became one of the primary stages on which that currency circulated. Courtiers learned to time their appearances, to position themselves along the mirrored wall so that their reflections might catch the king's eye, to move with studied casualness through a space where every gesture carried political weight. The mirrors themselves were a display of industrial and financial power. Plate glass of this size was difficult to manufacture in the 17th century. Most mirror panes were small, expensive, and imported from Venice, where glassmakers guarded their techniques with guild secrecy. The mirrors at Versailles were produced in France at the Royal Glass Manufactory, established in part to break the Venetian monopoly, and their scale announced that French industry could now rival the workshops of the lagoon. The cost was extraordinary. Contemporary estimates suggest that the mirrors alone required an expenditure equivalent to the construction of an entire warship. The chandeliers were equally ambitious. Suspended from the painted vault on gilt chains, each fixture held dozens of candles that would be lit on evenings of state ceremony, their flames reflected infinitely in the opposing mirrors, creating an effect of endless light receding into luminous depth. On such nights, the hall became a theater of illumination, the king moving through a space where his image multiplied in glass, where every surface gleamed with reflected fire, and where the boundary between real presence and mirrored illusion dissolved into choreographed spectacle. A contemporary observer noted that the hall was a dazzling setting to project the power and majesty of the French monarchy. The phrase, though shortened from a longer description, captures the intended effect: light and reflection transformed into instruments of political awe. The hall's design drew on traditions established elsewhere in Europe: galleries in Roman palaces, long chambers in Fontainebleau, the mirrored rooms being constructed in princely residences from Munich to Turin. But Versailles amplified the scale and integrated mirror, window, and painted ceiling into a unified program that subordinated aesthetic pleasure to the representation of sovereign authority. The space was not intimate. Its proportions were calculated to overwhelm, to reduce individual visitors to figures within a larger composition, to make clear that the true subject of the room was not the people who walked through it, but the monarchy whose image hung above them and reflected around them. Yet even in 1684, the Hall of Mirrors contained a paradox. It was built to be closed to the market, reserved for the court, a space of privilege inaccessible to the public, but it already functioned as a kind of theater. Courtiers performed their loyalty and ambition for an audience of peers and rivals. The king performed his majesty for a court trained to watch and interpret his every movement. The hall was not a private chamber. It was a stage, and the rituals enacted there were displays as carefully constructed as any play in the royal theaters. The difference was that the actors here wielded real power, made real decisions, and left real consequences in their wake. The painted ceiling fixed the king's victories in oil and plaster. The mirrors caught his image and let it shimmer across the surface of glass before vanishing with each step. In less than 2 centuries, this same room would host a museum opening, not a royal ball. But in 1684, such a future was unimaginable. The hall was eternal, because the monarchy was eternal, because the stones and mirrors and gilding declared a permanence that no courtier dared question aloud. The chandeliers burned, the court gathered, the reflections multiplied, and outside in the gardens the fountains ran according to schedules designed to conserve water, because even at Versailles there were limits that architecture could not overcome. By the middle of the 18th century, the Habsburg court had established a seasonal rhythm that alternated between the Hofburg in Vienna's old city center and the summer residence at Schönbrunn, located in the rolling landscape south of the capital, in what is now the city's 13th district. The palace at Schönbrunn had been rebuilt and expanded under Empress Maria Theresa, who commissioned the architect Nicolaus Picassi in the 1740s to transform the existing Baroque structure into a residence befitting the dignity and ceremonial needs of the Habsburg dynasty. The rebuilding took more than a decade, with work continuing through the 1750s on the state apartments, the Great Gallery, and the private chambers. Archival inventories from the period record payments to stuccoists, gilders, and painters, contracts with suppliers of marble from Salzburg and timber from the imperial forests, and detailed accounts of the furnishings, chandeliers from Bohemian glass workshops, tapestries woven in Brussels, parquet floors laid in geometric patterns that echoed the designs of the garden parterres. Schönbrunn was conceived as a counterpart to Versailles, a statement that the Habsburg court could match the French in grandeur and taste, but it was also shaped by the particular geography and political culture of the Austrian lands. Where Versailles sprawled across a flat plain and imposed geometric order on a landscape drained and reshaped by engineering, Schönbrunn nestled into a hillside, its garden axis rising toward the Gloriette pavilion on the crest above, a crown of columns framing a view back toward the palace facade and the distant city beyond. The relationship between architecture and landscape was less a conquest than a conversation. The palace positioned to command the view while also participating in the natural drama of slope and horizon. The Great Gallery occupied the central wing of the palace, a long ceremonial space lit by windows along one wall and reflecting that light in tall mirrors set into the opposite wall. The ceiling, painted with frescoes celebrating Habsburg rule, depicted allegorical scenes of imperial virtues, justice, strength, wisdom, alongside more specific references to military victories and diplomatic achievements. The decorative program was quieter than Versailles', less overtly martial, reflecting a court that prided itself on a certain pastoral ease, even as it presided over a multinational empire stretching from the Netherlands to the Balkans. The chandeliers in the Great Gallery were suspended from the frescoed vault on long chains, their crystal drops refracting daylight during afternoon receptions and candlelight during evening balls. Court records describe events held in this space: birthday celebrations for the empress, receptions for foreign ambassadors, concerts where the young Mozart performed for the imperial family, diplomatic banquets where the arrangement of tables in the order of service signaled the relative standing of kingdoms and principalities. Access to Schönbrunn during the summer months was a privilege distributed according to rank and favor. The palace was not open to the public. The gardens, though more accessible than the interior, were still patrolled by guards who ensured that only appropriate visitors wandered the gravel paths and paused at the fountains. Maria Theresa understood the palace as an extension of governance, a physical setting where the performance of majesty reinforced the legitimacy of her rule. She corresponded with architects and gardeners, approved designs for new parterres, and oversaw the creation of what would become the oldest continuously operating zoo in the world, established on the palace grounds in 1752. The menagerie was not a public attraction. It was a curated collection of exotic animals, elephants, camels, bears, tropical birds, displayed in radiating pavilions visible from the palace windows, a demonstration that Habsburg power extended even to the command of nature's diversity. Visitors from other courts were invited to tour the menagerie and were expected to be impressed by the reach and resources it implied. Schönbrunn's scale was impressive. 1,441 rooms by some later counts, though many were utilitarian spaces for servants, storage, and administration. The staterooms occupied the central blocks, their ceilings higher, their proportions more generous, their decoration more elaborate. Morning light along the gravel axis to the gloriette fell at an angle that gilded the facade. Cool stone beneath visitors' feet reminded them of the palace's weight and permanence. The muted echo beneath the great gallery's chandeliers lent even casual conversation a sense of ceremony. The summer palace embodied a particular 18th century ideal, the idea that a monarch could be both accessible and remote, both pastoral and imperial. The court moved to Schönbrunn to escape the formality of the Hofburg, yet the rituals at Schönbrunn were themselves elaborately formal. The gardens suggested ease, but their geometry was as rigidly controlled as any military parade ground. The palace expressed confidence that landscape and city alike could be arranged along a ruler's line of sight, that architecture could organize both space and society into legible, harmonious order. Here, chandeliers were not merely ornaments. They were instruments that turned night into another stage of government, their light extending the hours during which power could be performed and witnessed. From the 18th century until 1918, Schönbrunn would remain the Habsburg summer residence, then pass almost overnight from dynastic home to public museum. In the autumn of 1869, King Ludwig II of Bavaria signed contracts for the construction of a new castle on the site of two ruined medieval fortifications above the village of Hohenschwangau, near Füssen, in the Bavarian Alps. The location was remote, accessible only by steep forest roads, but it commanded dramatic views across the valley and toward the peaks of the Ammergau range. Ludwig had grown up at Hohenschwangau Castle, a reconstructed medieval residence where his father, King Maximilian II, had fostered a romantic vision of Bavaria's historical identity. Now, Ludwig, recently ascended to the throne, planned a retreat even more secluded and more thoroughly infused with the aesthetic ideals he had absorbed from Richard Wagner's operas and from his own reading of medieval legend. The new castle, initially called New Hohenschwangau but later known as Neuschwanstein, was designed by the architect Eduard Riedel, who worked from Ludwig's detailed instructions. The king's letters and memoranda describe a building inspired by the architecture of medieval Wartburg Castle in Thuringia, by the sets and costumes of Wagner's Tannhäuser and Lohengrin, and by an idealized vision of knightly culture that had little to do with historical Bavaria and everything to do with Ludwig's desire to inhabit a world of his own imagining. Construction began in 1869 with the blasting and leveling of the clifftop site, and would continue for 17 years, though the castle would never be completed according to Ludwig's plans. Neuschwanstein was conceived as a private residence, not a palace for court functions. Ludwig intended it as a refuge from the political constraints and public duties he increasingly resented. He had come to the throne in 1864 at the age of 18 and had quickly discovered that constitutional monarchy in a modernizing Germany offered little room for the romantic absolutism he admired. Bavaria was being drawn into the orbit of Prussia, The king's role was ceremonial more than substantive, and Ludwig found parliamentary politics distasteful. He began to withdraw, spending longer periods at his mountain residences, commissioning ever more elaborate building projects that drained the royal treasury and alarmed his ministers. The architecture of Neuschwanstein reflected this withdrawal. The exterior was Romanesque revival, with towers, turrets, and battlements that evoked medieval fortress design, though the interiors were planned with 19th-century conveniences, central heating, running water, electric bells for summoning servants. The principal rooms included a throne hall and a singer's hall, both inspired by spaces in Wartburg Castle and both designed to host ceremonies that would never take place. The throne hall was modeled after a Byzantine church, with a 2-story apse and a coffered ceiling painted to resemble a starry sky. An enormous chandelier, one of the largest ever constructed, hung in the center of this space, a crown of gilt and crystal designed to illuminate a throne that was never installed. Ludwig died before the throne could be delivered, and the hall remains an empty stage, its chandelier suspended above a floor where no coronation, no ceremony of homage was ever performed. The Singers' Hall, located on the 4th floor of the palace tower, was equally theatrical. Its walls were covered with murals depicting scenes from the Parsifal legend, and its proportions were designed to accommodate performances that, in Ludwig's vision, would rival the medieval song contests he had read about in literature. The room was large enough to hold an audience, but Ludwig himself rarely invited guests. The castle was his solitude, and the elaborately decorated chambers were spaces where he could move alone through a fantasy of kingship, unencumbered by subjects, ministers, or political reality. Only about a dozen rooms were completed by the time of Ludwig's death in 1886. Architects' plans show that the original design included far more extensive quarters, additional towers, and a chapel, but construction slowed as funds became scarce, and as Ludwig's attention shifted to other projects, Linderhof Palace, Herrenchiemsee Palace, each more extravagant and more remote than the last. By the mid-1880s, Ludwig was heavily in debt, and his ministers and relatives were increasingly concerned about his mental state and his financial irresponsibility. In June 1886, a commission of doctors declared him unfit to rule. He was placed under house arrest at Berg Castle on Lake Starnberg. 3 days later, on June 13, 1886, Ludwig and his psychiatrist were found dead in shallow water near the lakeshore. The circumstances remain disputed. The official report called it a suicide, though no definitive evidence supports that conclusion. Some historians suggest an accident, others hint at something more sinister. The ambiguity has never been resolved. In a century building railways and parliaments, Ludwig ordered a mountain crowned with painted legends and empty thrones. The chandelier in the throne hall was designed as the visible apex of royal authority, but it shone only over fantasies. Just 7 weeks after his death in 1886, the unfinished castle was opened, not to courtiers, but to paying visitors. In the spring of 1833, Louis-Philippe I, King of the French, issued a decree establishing a museum of the history of France at the Palace of Versailles. The decision marked a deliberate transformation of a building that had been the seat of absolute monarchy into a national institution dedicated, in the king's words, to all the glories of France. Louis-Philippe had come to power in 1830, following the July Revolution that deposed Charles VI, and his reign balanced between legitimist claims and the demands of a constitutional order. The museum project was one strategy for managing that balance. By recasting Versailles as a monument to national history rather than dynastic privilege, Louis-Philippe sought to appropriate the palace's symbolic weight for a new political narrative. The palace had suffered during the Revolution and the subsequent decades. Royal furnishings had been sold or dispersed, apartments had been damaged or altered, and successive governments had debated the building's future, proposing everything from demolition to conversion into barracks or a school. Louis-Philippe's museum project saved the structure, but radically altered its interiors. Architects and curators removed walls, reconfigured rooms, and demolished many of the original royal apartments to create galleries suitable for displaying historical paintings. The Hall of Mirrors remained largely intact, but other spaces were gutted and rebuilt according to the needs of exhibition rather than habitation. The museum opened to the public in 1837 with a vast collection of paintings, sculptures, and engravings illustrating French history from the early Middle Ages to the recent past. The Galerie des Batailles, installed in the palace's south wing, stretched more than 120 meters and displayed enormous canvases depicting military victories from Tolbiac to Wagram. The thematic arrangement privileged moments of national triumph and figures of heroic leadership, constructing a historical narrative that transcended political divisions and presented France as a continuous entity whose glory persisted across regime changes. The collection included portraits of kings, generals, statesmen, and revolutionaries, arranged in a visual argument that French greatness was a trans-historical fact rather than the property of any single dynasty or government. The Hall of Mirrors, once the setting for court rituals, became a passage within this museum circuit. Visitors walked beneath the chandeliers that had illuminated royal audiences, but the light now fell on tourists and students rather than courtiers. The space retained its architectural grandeur, the mirrors, the marble pilasters, the painted ceiling, but its social function had changed. It was no longer a stage for the performance of power, but a gallery for the contemplation of history. The chandeliers still hung from the same chains, their crystal drops refracting the same patterns of light, but the meaning of that light had shifted. Where once it had multiplied the king's presence, it now illuminated an absence, a memory of ceremonies that would not return. The transformation of Versailles into a museum was not universally celebrated. Critics argued that the destruction of original interiors represented a loss of historical authenticity, that the museum's narrative was propagandistic, and that the palace's architectural integrity had been sacrificed to political expediency. Defenders countered that the museum preserved the building when demolition remained a real possibility, that it provided public access to spaces formerly reserved for the elite, and that historical paintings were a form of collective memory more valuable than empty rooms. Both arguments had merit. The palace ceased to function as a residence, but gained a new role as a pedagogical instrument. By the late 19th century, visitors could walk through the galleries much as they do today, following marked routes, pausing before large-scale history paintings, and moving through the Hall of Mirrors as one stop on a longer tour. The museum model established at Versailles influenced other European sites. Former royal palaces in Germany, Italy, and Austria adopted similar strategies, converting dynastic residences into public museums that balanced preservation with access, memory with education. The palace became a template for how nations could manage the architectural legacies of overthrown or obsolete monarchies. The chandeliers in the Hall of Mirrors remained in place, maintained by government conservators rather than royal servants. Their candles were eventually replaced by electric bulbs. Their cleaning and repair became matters of technical procedure rather than ceremonial protocol. The mirrors reflected crowds instead of courtiers, tour groups instead of aristocrats, and the space became legible as both artifact and attraction. Afternoon light on battle paintings, the muffled footsteps on restored parquet, the echo of a guide's voice describing events that never actually occurred in these rooms. These became the sensory markers of Versailles as a museum. The palace ceased to rule and began instead to remember. By the late 19th century, visitors could walk these galleries under chandeliers that now lit paintings instead of policy. In November 1918, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed and the First World War drew to its conclusion, the Habsburg monarchy came to an end. Emperor Karl the Vereiners, who had succeeded Franz Joseph in 1916, renounced participation in government but did not formally abdicate. The distinction mattered legally but made little difference politically. The new Austrian Republic declared itself on November 12, 1918, and among the assets it inherited was Schönbrunn Palace, which had served as the Habsburgs' summer residence for nearly 2 centuries. Franz Joseph had died at Schönbrunn in November 1916, and the palace carried the accumulated memory of imperial rule. State visits, diplomatic receptions, family celebrations, and the daily rituals of court life that had structured Habsburg governance. The Republican government faced an immediate question. What to do with a palace designed for monarchy in a nation now committed to democratic principles? Demolition was discussed but dismissed as too costly and too symbolically fraught. The palace was already recognized as an architectural landmark, and its destruction would have been read as vandalism rather than revolutionary clarity. The decision was made to preserve Schönbrunn as a museum, opening its staterooms to the public and using the site as both a historical monument and a source of cultural prestige for the new republic. Early Republican officials and curators undertook inventories of the palace's contents, cataloging furnishings, artworks, and decorative objects that had been accumulated over generations. Visitor regulations were drafted, access routes were planned, and the palace began its transformation from private residence to public institution. The same great gallery where imperial balls had been held now hosted guided tours. The chandeliers that had illuminated Habsburg ceremonies became museum exhibits in themselves, symbols of a vanished social order maintained by technicians and conservators rather than by liveried servants. The shift was as much conceptual as functional. The palace's value was no longer determined by who lived there, but by how many people visited and what meaning they derived from the encounter. The interwar years were difficult for Austria. Economic instability, political polarization, and the eventual annexation by Nazi Germany in 1938 disrupted any consistent approach to heritage management. During the Second World War, Schönbrunn suffered damage from bombing, and parts of the palace were requisitioned for military use. After 1945, Austria was occupied by Allied forces, and Schönbrunn briefly served as the headquarters for British occupation authorities. Restoration began slowly in the post-war years, constrained by limited budgets and competing demands for reconstruction across the country. By the 1960s and 1970s, as Austria's economy recovered and tourism began to expand, Schönbrunn emerged as one of the nation's most important cultural attractions. The palace was promoted internationally as a symbol of Austrian heritage, and visitor numbers grew steadily. In 1992, the Austrian government established Schloss Schönbrunn Kultur- und Betriebs-GS.mbH, a state-owned company tasked with managing the palace as a self-financing operation. The arrangement reflected broader trends in heritage management, where cultural sites were increasingly expected to generate revenue through ticket sales, events, and commercial ventures, while also maintaining conservation standards and educational missions. The Great Gallery, once reserved for court functions, now hosted not only museum tours but also ticketed concerts, state receptions for visiting dignitaries, and private events that could be rented for corporate functions and weddings. The palace's business model diversified. In addition to admission fees, revenue came from venue rentals, souvenir sales, and licensing agreements that allowed the Schönbrunn brand to appear on products ranging from coffee to confectionery. The palace's architecture remained unchanged, but its role within the economy had expanded far beyond anything imagined by its Habsburg patrons. Park gates, once controlled by imperial guards, were now open to joggers, commuters, and school groups. The gardens, originally designed for aristocratic promenades, became a public park where locals walked dogs, students read on benches, and tourists photographed the Gloriette pavilion framed against the Vienna sky. Winter fog in the vast forecourt, the grit of gravel under visitor shoes, the soft mechanical buzz of climate controls protecting artifacts from the humidity of millions of breaths. These were the new sensory facts of Schönbrunn, a palace that had survived revolution, war, and occupation by adapting its function without erasing its history. The chandeliers that once marked rank now marked ticket categories: standard, audio guide, grand tour. By the early 21st century, Schönbrunn would welcome around 3.5 to 3.8 million visits each year, making it Vienna's most visited cultural attraction. In early August 1886, just 7 weeks after Ludwig IX's death on Lake Starnberg, the Bavarian state government opened Neuschwanstein Castle to paying visitors. The decision was made by Prince Regent Luitpold, who assumed regency on behalf of Ludwig's younger brother Otto, who had been declared incapable of ruling due to mental illness. The move was as much financial as symbolic. Ludwig's building projects had left the Wittelsbach family deep in debt, and the Regency hoped that ticket revenues might help offset some of those obligations. The castle, though incomplete, was spectacular enough to attract curiosity, and its location in the increasingly accessible Bavarian Alps made it a plausible destination for the growing tourist traffic that railways had begun to deliver to the region. Early visitors paid a small admission fee and were conducted through the limited number of finished rooms by guides who explained the castle's history and pointed out its decorative features. Newspaper reports from the period described tourists arriving by train at Füssen, hiring carriages to Hohenschwangau, and then climbing the steep path to the castle entrance. Guidebooks began to appear, some published within months of the opening, describing Neuschwanstein as King Ludwig's fairy tale castle, and emphasizing the romantic drama of the unfinished project and the mysterious circumstances of the king's death. The castle's appeal was not solely architectural, it was also narrative, a story of royal obsession and tragic end that lent the stone and murals an aura of Gothic melancholy. By 1890, visitor numbers had grown steadily, and estate administrators recorded ticket revenues in official reports. The income helped reduce Ludwig's debts, and by 1899, the accounts showed that the worst financial obligations had been managed. The castle, built as a private refuge, turned out to be the most profitable Wittelsbach property, precisely because it was open to the public. Tourists paid to see the spaces Ludwig had created to escape them, an irony that contemporary observers occasionally noted in travel memoirs and newspaper columns. The rooms open to visitors included the throne hall, with its immense chandelier suspended over an empty floor where no throne had been installed, the Singer's Hall, with its murals of the Parsifal legend, and Ludwig's private apartments decorated in rich fabrics and carved woodwork, but never fully inhabited. The tours were brief, tightly managed, and designed to move groups through the space efficiently without allowing lingering or unsupervised exploration. Even in the 1890s, the castle operated according to principles that would later be called visitor flow management, techniques for maximizing revenue while minimizing wear on fragile interiors. The castle's popularity grew in tandem with the rise of organized tourism in Europe. Thomas Cook and other travel companies began including Neuschwanstein in itineraries for middle-class travelers from Britain, France, and the United States. Railways made the region accessible. Hotels and restaurants opened in Füssen and Hohenschwangau to serve the influx, and souvenir vendors began selling postcards, photographs, and small replicas of the castle. The local economy adapted to the tourist trade, and Neuschwanstein became a central node in a broader regional network of attractions that included Linderhof Palace, the pilgrimage church at Wies, and the alpine scenery of the Bavarian highlands. By the eve of the First World War, visitor numbers at Neuschwanstein approached 200,000 annually, a figure that reflected both the castle's fame and the expansion of leisure travel among Europe's urban middle classes. The war temporarily reduced tourism, but numbers rebounded in the 1920s and continued to grow through the subsequent decades, interrupted only by the Second World War. The castle survived both conflicts largely undamaged, its remote location protecting it from the destruction that affected many urban monuments. The echo of boots and then rubber soles on steep interior stairs, cool stone walls, the muffled thud of doors closing between tour groups, these became the acoustic signatures of Neuschwanstein as a managed attraction. The throne hall chandelier, originally conceived as a crown of state, now shone over tour groups guided through carefully timed circuits. The castle's transformation from personal fantasy to public spectacle was complete within a generation of Ludwig's death. What he had built to escape modernity became one of modernity's favorite destinations. The king built it to escape the crowd paid to walk through the escape. On the eve of the First World War, visitor numbers at Neuschwanstein already approached 200,000 a year, a prelude to the millions who would follow. By the final decades of the 20th century, the Palace of Versailles had become one of France's most visited cultural sites, drawing millions of tourists annually from across the globe. The transformation from royal residence to national museum, begun under Louis-Philippe in the 1830s, had evolved further with each generation, reflecting changing attitudes toward heritage, conservation, and public access. The Hall of Mirrors, once illuminated by candlelight for courtly ceremonies, now glowed under electric restoration lighting installed after a major conservation campaign completed in 2007. That restoration, led by Frédéric Didier, chief architect of France's historical monuments, returned the hall's decorative surfaces to something approaching their 18th century appearance, removing layers of soot and grime accumulated over centuries and re-gilding surfaces that had dulled with age. Didier described the hall as the heart of the Palace of Versailles, and the restoration project received international attention as both technical achievement and cultural investment. The restoration also marked a shift in how heritage sites manage the tension between preservation and access. Versailles had long struggled with the physical impact of mass visitation. Millions of footsteps wore down parquet floors. Humidity from breath and perspiration damaged painted surfaces. Vibrations from foot traffic stressed fragile structures. In response, palace administrators introduced measures designed to protect the building while maintaining visitor throughput. Velvet ropes and stanchions directed foot traffic along predetermined routes. Climate control systems regulated temperature and humidity. Security, glass protected vulnerable decorative elements, and time ticketing limited the number of visitors in any given space at any given time. These interventions reshaped the visitor experience in subtle but significant ways. The palace became a space of regulated flows, where spontaneity was constrained by the needs of conservation and the logistics of managing large crowds. Visitors moved through the Hall of Mirrors as part of a choreographed procession, pausing at designated viewpoints, prohibited from touching surfaces, and guided by signage, audio tours, and occasionally live interpreters. The room still performed magnificence, but the performance was now as much about visitor management as about architectural grandeur. Alongside conservation efforts, Versailles expanded its commercial operations. Gift shops appeared within or adjacent to palace spaces, selling books, jewelry, DVDs, games, stationery, and other souvenirs that carried the palace's imagery: chandeliers, mirrors, royal portraits, and motifs from the decorative arts. Online and physical boutiques monetized the palace's aesthetic legacy, offering products that ranged from scholarly publications to high-end reproductions of furniture and decorative objects to inexpensive trinkets aimed at casual visitors. The commercial strategy reflected broader trends in museum management, where ticket revenues alone were insufficient to cover operating costs, and where merchandising became a necessary supplement to public funding. The hum of air conditioning in the Hall of Mirrors, flashes of cameras, allowed at certain times and prohibited at others, depending on shifting policies. The rustle of plastic bags bearing the same gilded motifs once reserved for tapestries. These became part of the sensory experience of visiting Versailles in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The palace functioned simultaneously as historical monument, educational institution, and branded commodity. Its image circulated on scarves, notebooks, coffee mugs, tote bags, and Instagram feeds, reaching audiences who would never visit in person, but who engaged with Versailles as a symbol of French cultural prestige and aesthetic refinement. Tourism officials and preservation experts debated the implications of this transformation. Some argued that commercialization trivialized the palace's historical significance, that souvenir shops cheapened the experience, and that the focus on visitor satisfaction came at the expense of deeper engagement with the site's complex past. Others countered that merchandising funded conservation, that accessibility was a public good, and that the palace's survival depended on its ability to generate revenue and maintain relevance in an increasingly competitive cultural marketplace. Both perspectives contained truth. The palace had survived by adapting, but adaptation always involved compromise. Versailles also served functions beyond tourism. The Hall of Mirrors remained a venue for state occasions. In 1919, it had hosted the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, and in subsequent decades it continued to serve as a setting for diplomatic receptions and official ceremonies. The palace thus maintained a political role even as it became a heritage attraction, embodying a continuity between France's monarchical past and its republican present. The chandeliers still belonged to the state, but their reflections circulated on tote bags and Instagram feeds. Versailles now functioned as both a symbol of national identity and branded commodity, its architecture preserved through the very commercialization that some critics claimed distorted its meaning. Today, the palace is open to visitors 6 days a week, supported in part by the very souvenirs sold in its shadow. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna was reimagined as a multi-layered destination, its identity expanding beyond museum to encompass zoo, concert venue, Christmas market, event space, and cultural brand. The palace, which had been managed as a self-financing operation since the establishment of Schloss Schönbrunn Kultur- und Betriebsgas mbH in 1992, exemplified a model of heritage management in which historic sites were expected to generate revenue while maintaining conservation standards and fulfilling educational missions. Annual reports from the management company documented approximately 3 to 3.8 million visits per year, making Schönbrunn Austria's most visited cultural attraction and positioning it as a central asset in Vienna's tourism economy. The diversification of Schönbrunn's programming reflected broader trends in what scholars began to call the experience economy, where cultural sites competed not only with other museums, but with entertainment venues, theme parks, and leisure destinations of all kinds. Visitors to Schönbrunn could tour the state apartments in the morning, visit the zoo, still operating on the palace grounds, now modernized and accredited. In the afternoon, attend a chamber music concert in the Orangery in the evening, and return in December for the Christmas market that occupied the palace forecourt, where vendors sold handicrafts, seasonal foods, and souvenirs beneath strings of lights strung between Baroque facades. The Great Gallery, once reserved for imperial balls, now hosted ticketed concerts featuring works by Mozart, Haydn, and Strauss, performed by ensembles in period costume for audiences who had paid premium prices for the combination of music and historical setting. The concerts were marketed internationally, appearing in tourism brochures and online booking platforms, and they drew visitors who might not otherwise have toured the palace. The acoustic properties of the gallery, designed for conversation and ceremony rather than musical performance, were less than ideal, but the visual spectacle of the space, the frescoed ceiling, the mirrors, the chandeliers, provided an immersive backdrop that satisfied audiences seeking an authentic encounter with Viennese cultural heritage. The palace's commercial strategy extended to venue rentals. The Great Gallery and other staterooms could be reserved for private events, corporate receptions, product launches, weddings, at rates that varied according to the space, the time of year, and the level of service required. These events generated significant revenue, but also raised questions about the appropriateness of using historic spaces for commercial purposes. Critics argued that renting out palace rooms for private parties risked turning Schönbrunn into a theme park atmosphere, where historical meaning was subordinated to entertainment value. Defenders countered that such events brought new audiences to the palace, that revenue supported conservation, and that flexible programming was necessary for financial sustainability in an era of declining public funding for cultural institutions. The Christmas market at Schönbrunn became one of Vienna's most popular seasonal attractions, drawing visitors who came not primarily for the palace itself, but for the festive atmosphere of the market stalls, the smell of mulled wine and roasted chestnuts, the sound of seasonal music echoing across the forecourt. The market occupied the space between the palace facade and the formal gardens, transforming the once exclusive domain of Habsburg power into a public gathering place where locals and tourists mingled, purchased gifts, and consumed food and drink in a setting framed by yellow Baroque architecture and the glow of chandeliers visible through the gallery windows. Evening light on the yellow facade, the smell of mulled wine beneath chandeliers shining through tall windows, the murmur of amplified Vivaldi in a hall once filled with acoustic sound alone. These sensory elements defined Schönbrunn's contemporary identity. The palace had become a curated experience, carefully programmed to balance historical preservation with visitor satisfaction, conservation with commercialization, educational mission with economic necessity. Scholarly discussions of this transformation often invoked the term Disneyfication, a concept borrowed from cultural criticism to describe how historic sites evolved into immersive, themed environments optimized for visitor enjoyment. The term carried pejorative connotations, suggesting superficiality and commodification, but it also captured something real about the way heritage management had changed. Schönbrunn, like many major cultural sites, had become a product as well as a place, its architecture and history packaged and marketed to diverse audiences seeking a range of experiences from education to entertainment to social display. Preservation reports from the palace management noted that millions of visitors and thousands of events placed significant stress on fragile historic interiors. Conservation staff monitored climate conditions, tracked structural movement, and scheduled regular maintenance of decorative surfaces and furnishings. The chandelier in the Great Gallery hung above not only protocol but programming, its crystal drops refracting light from LEDs that replaced the candles of earlier centuries, its maintenance scheduled according to technical manuals rather than courtly ritual. The chandelier here now hangs above not only protocol but programming. In preservation reports, Schönbrunn's managers note that millions of visitors and thousands of events must coexist with fragile stucco and gilt. By the opening decades of the 21st century, Neuschwanstein Castle had become one of the most visited heritage sites in Europe, receiving approximately 1.3 to 1.5 million visitors per year, with daily numbers on summer days sometimes reaching 6,000. The castle, built by Ludwig II as a private retreat and opened to the public just weeks after his death, had evolved into a global icon of romantic fantasy, its image reproduced on countless postcards, posters, travel brochures, and digital screens. The silhouette of Neuschwanstein, towers and turrets rising from the forested clifftop, was instantly recognizable, often cited as an inspiration for the castle designs in Disney theme parks, though the comparison was one that heritage professionals approached with ambivalence. The castle's popularity brought both benefits and challenges. Ticket revenues supported conservation and maintenance, and the site provided employment for guides, administrators, and service workers in the surrounding communities. But the sheer volume of visitors placed immense pressure on the building's infrastructure and on the natural landscape of the surrounding area. Access roads were crowded with shuttle buses, horse-drawn carriages, and pedestrian traffic. Parking lots filled early each day. Ticket centers managed timed entry slots, selling advance reservations online and limiting walk-up access during peak periods. The visitor experience was tightly scripted. Tours lasted approximately 30 minutes, moved through a fixed sequence of rooms, and prohibited interior photography to speed up group transitions and protect the integrity of the decorative surfaces. Bavarian officials celebrated the castle's designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, part of a transnational nomination that recognized the cultural significance of Ludwig II's palaces. But the celebration was tempered by acknowledgments that the site's popularity brought risks as well as prestige. Some commentators noted the mixture of kitsch and cliché that surrounded the castle: souvenir shops selling snow globes, magnets, and T-shirts, cafes offering overpriced schnitzel and coffee, vendors hawking umbrellas and hats to tourists unprepared for alpine weather. Travel writers and visitors described Neuschwanstein as a tourist trap, a term that captured frustration with crowds, commercial excess, and the sense that the experience had been engineered for maximum throughput rather than contemplative engagement. Yet for many visitors, these criticisms were beside the point. Neuschwanstein offered what it promised: a dramatic hilltop castle, richly decorated interiors, and a narrative of royal obsession that lent the architecture a layer of emotional depth. The castle functioned as a pilgrimage site for those seeking escape into fantasy, and the fact that millions of others shared the same destination did not necessarily diminish the experience. The crowds were part of the phenomenon, evidence of the site's hold on the contemporary imagination. The throne hall chandelier, one of the largest ever constructed, continued to dominate the space where Ludwig's throne had never been installed. The chandelier illuminated brief, tightly scripted visits, its light falling now on explanatory panels, velvet ropes, and groups of tourists listening to audio guides in a dozen languages. The Singers' Hall, with its murals of Parsifal, echoed with the shuffling feet and murmured conversations of visitors moving through at intervals calibrated to prevent bottlenecks. The sound of shuttle buses and horse carriages on the approach road, the smell of coffee and fried food mixing with pine air, the echoed instructions of guides inside the stone shell. These were the sensory facts of Neuschwanstein in the age of mass tourism. Debates about over-tourism and authenticity intensified in the early 21st century as heritage sites around the world grappled with similar pressures. Scholars and tourism professionals used terms like Disneyfication and commodification to describe processes by which historic places were transformed into themed, consumable experiences. Some argued that such transformations eroded the historical meaning of sites, reducing complex pasts to simplified narratives designed for easy consumption. Others countered that accessibility and popular engagement were democratic goods, that heritage should be shared rather than reserved for elites, and that financial sustainability required adaptation to market realities. Neuschwanstein embodied these tensions. It was simultaneously a serious work of architecture, a monument to one man's psychological retreat, and a commercial success that rivaled major theme parks in visitor numbers. The castle's meaning depended on who was asked and what criteria were applied. For heritage professionals, it was a conservation challenge and a case study in managing high-volume tourism. For local businesses, it was an economic engine. For visitors, it was a bucket list destination, a photo opportunity, a story to tell friends, or a moment of genuine encounter with beauty and history. The chandelier swung not with courtly dances, but with the vibrations of thousands of footsteps a day. The king had built the castle to be alone. The public paid to walk through his solitude. Here, the chandelier swings not with courtly dances, but with the vibrations of thousands of footsteps a day. In some years, Neuschwanstein's visitor numbers rival those of major theme parks, yet its stone was laid for a king who wanted to be alone. The administrative lives of major heritage sites in the late 20th and early 21st centuries involved complex negotiations among conservation professionals, government officials, tourism managers, and international heritage organizations. Palaces like Versailles, Schönbrunn, and Neuschwanstein operated within frameworks established by UNESCO, which designated sites of outstanding universal value as World Heritage, and provided both symbolic prestige and practical guidance on conservation standards. UNESCO dossiers described Schönbrunn as a remarkable Baroque ensemble and Neuschwanstein as dreams in stone, language that reflected the organization's mandate to identify and protect cultural landmarks while also acknowledging their appeal to global audiences. The designation as a World Heritage Site brought benefits and obligations. Sites gained international recognition that boosted tourism, but they also accepted oversight and monitoring by UNESCO, which required regular reporting on conservation efforts, visitor management, and threats to the site's integrity. Palace directors, architects of historic monuments, and heritage officials whose work shaped these reports navigated pressures that were both technical and political. How to balance the revenue generated by tourism against the wear caused by millions of visitors. How to fund necessary restoration while maintaining accessibility. How to modernize infrastructure without compromising historical authenticity. Versailles, Schönbrunn, and Neuschwanstein each developed institutional structures designed to address these challenges. Versailles operated as a public establishment under French law, funded by a combination of state support and self-generated revenue. Schönbrunn's self-financing model, managed by a state-owned company, represented a more entrepreneurial approach, treating the palace as a cultural enterprise expected to cover its operating costs through diverse revenue streams. Neuschwanstein remained under the administration of the Bavarian Palace Department, a state agency responsible for multiple historic properties, with funding drawn from ticket sales, state budgets, and occasional grants for major conservation projects. Behind the public-facing experience of palace tourism lay extensive technical operations. Climate control systems monitored and regulated temperature and humidity in historic interiors, protecting painted surfaces, textiles, and woodwork from the damaging effects of fluctuating conditions. Lighting systems were designed to illuminate spaces for visitors while minimizing ultraviolet exposure that could fade pigments and degrade materials. Structural monitoring systems tracked movement in foundations, walls, and roofs, providing early warning of potential problems. Security systems protected against theft, vandalism, and fire, concerns that intensified as visitor numbers grew and as terrorist threats became part of the operational calculus for major cultural sites. Conservation staff at these palaces included not only art historians and curators, but also engineers, scientists, and craftspeople with specialized expertise in traditional building materials and techniques. The chandeliers in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, for instance, were inspected by engineers who understood the stress loads on chains and mountings, cleaned on scheduled cycles by technicians trained in handling fragile crystal, and occasionally rewired by electricians working under the supervision of conservation architects. What had once been maintained through courtly rituals of care, servants polishing crystal, replacing candles, adjusting chains, was now managed through technical procedures documented in maintenance schedules, conservation reports, and digital databases tracking the condition of thousands of individual objects and architectural elements. The beep of electronic counters at doorways, tracking visitor numbers and flow patterns, the rattle of portable stanchions being set up before opening, directing foot traffic, the quiet tick of monitoring equipment behind gilded walls, recording data on environmental conditions. These were the sounds of palaces operating as finely tuned machines, balancing conservation and revenue. Heritage professionals became, in effect, stewards not only of stone and stucco but of expectations, managing what visitors hoped to feel when they stepped under a chandelier, what they wanted to take away from the experience, and how that experience could be delivered in ways that were both financially sustainable and respectful of the site's historical significance. Global debates on sustainable tourism and Disneyfication framed these discussions. Scholars and practitioners asked whether heritage sites could maintain authenticity while adapting to the demands of mass tourism, whether commercialization inevitably trivialized historical meaning, and whether local communities benefited from or were harmed by the economic transformations driven by heritage tourism. The term Disneyfication referred to processes by which places were transformed into themed, commercially optimized spaces, often at the expense of complexity, ambiguity, and the lived experiences of residents. Critics pointed to overcrowded sites, homogenized visitor experiences, and the displacement of local communities by tourism infrastructure. Defenders argued that tourism created jobs, funded conservation, and democratized access to cultural heritage that had historically been reserved for elites. These debates were not abstract. They played out in policy decisions, budget allocations, and daily operations at sites like Versailles, Schönbrunn, and Neuschwanstein. Palace administrators balanced competing demands, maximizing revenue without overwhelming the site, maintaining conservation standards while minimizing disruption to visitors, respecting historical authenticity while acknowledging that some adaptation was necessary for the site's survival. The palace survives, but it must now compete in the market of emotions, offering experiences that satisfy diverse audiences with different expectations and levels of cultural literacy. The chandeliers that had once illuminated the rituals of monarchy now lit pathways for tour groups, their crystals refracting light that was electric rather than candlelit, their maintenance recorded in spreadsheets rather than courtly account books. In annual reports, these former seats of absolute rule were assessed not in decrees, but in visitor numbers, ticket tiers, and satisfaction ratings. In the mid-1980s, the photographer Robert Polidori gained access to the Palace of Versailles during extensive restoration work, documenting interiors that were closed to the public and capturing images of rooms that contradicted the polished grandeur visible along official tour routes. Polidori's photographs showed the Hall of Mirrors not as a gleaming gallery, but as a construction site. Scaffolding rising to the ceiling, protective plastic sheeting wrapped around chandeliers, exposed electrical wiring snaking across parquet floors, sections of gilding peeled back to reveal underlying plaster. His images recorded conservators at work, testing surfaces, applying solvents, consulting archival drawings and chemical analyses to determine original color schemes and materials. The photographs revealed the dual reality of Versailles, the curated surfaces presented to visitors and the hidden labor required to maintain those surfaces. Restoration campaigns at Versailles, Schönbrunn, and Neuschwanstein followed similar patterns. Each project began with research, archival documents describing original construction, paint analysis revealing layers of color applied over centuries, structural assessments identifying areas of deterioration. Decisions about restoration involved both technical and philosophical questions, whether to restore surfaces to their original 18th century appearance or to preserve later alterations that had become part of the building's history. Whether to use traditional materials and techniques even when those were expensive and slow, or to accept modern substitutes that achieved similar visual effects more efficiently, whether to prioritize aesthetic coherence or documentary authenticity. The Hall of Mirrors restoration completed in 2007 reflected these debates. Conservators removed soot and grime, re-gilded surfaces that had dulled, and repaired cracks in painted panels, but they also documented each intervention, photographing conditions before and after treatment, recording materials used, and archiving samples of removed material for future study. The result was a space that approximated its 18th century appearance more closely than at any time since the early 20th century, but also a space whose every surface carried traces of modern conservation techniques, synthetic adhesives, modern pigments formulated to match historical colors, climate control systems concealed behind decorative elements. Velvet ropes appeared in these palaces as tools of triage, protecting fragile surfaces from millions of hands, marking boundaries between spaces open to the public and areas reserved for staff, and directing visitors along routes designed to maximize throughput while minimizing wear. The ropes were practical necessities, but they also shaped the visitor experience in fundamental ways. They created a distance between viewer and object, reinforcing the idea that heritage was something to be observed rather than touched, that the past was fragile and required protection from the present. The ropes formalized what had always been implicit, that visitors were guests in spaces not designed for them, tolerated because their admission fees funded the building's survival. The smell of solvents in closed galleries, the rattle of scaffold joints, the thin light from work lamps refracting through a chandelier's crystal drops, these sensory elements belong to a version of Versailles, Schönbrunn, and Neuschwanstein that most visitors never encountered. Yet this backstage reality was as much a part of the palace's contemporary existence as the polished galleries visible to tour groups. Conservators worked in attics and basements, in workshops filled with fragments awaiting restoration, in storage rooms where surplus furnishings and decorative elements were cataloged and preserved against future need. These spaces told a different story than the state apartments, a story of ongoing negotiation between preservation and entropy, of constant small interventions required to maintain the illusion of permanence. Some heritage sites began offering behind-the-scenes tours, recognizing that exclusivity itself could be a product. At Versailles, visitors willing to pay premium prices could access areas normally closed to the public, touring private apartments, climbing into attic spaces, and viewing storage rooms where objects too fragile or too numerous for display were carefully maintained. These tours marketed the idea that deeper engagement with the site's history required access to its hidden layers, that understanding a palace meant seeing not only the polished surfaces, but also the infrastructure that kept those surfaces shining. The chandelier, in this context, was no longer just an object, but the outcome of countless decisions about materials, about techniques, about the acceptable level of intervention, about the balance between historical accuracy and practical necessity. Each crystal drop, hanging in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, represented not only the craftsmanship of 18th century glassmakers, but also the choices of 20th and 21st century conservators who determined how that crystal should be cleaned, supported, and displayed. The chandelier existed in multiple temporalities simultaneously, as an artifact of 1684, as an object conserved in 2007, and as an element in the ongoing performance of heritage that visitors encountered in the present. What visitors saw was already an interpretation framed by conservation choices and economic realities. The palace was not preserved in its original state. Such a state was impossible to determine and impractical to maintain, but in a state determined by contemporary values, budgets, and technical capabilities. The chandelier shone not with the light of the past, but with the light chosen by the present to represent the past. Restoration campaigns recorded not only layers of paint, but layers of meaning, each one another step away from the lived palace. The transformation of palaces into heritage attractions affected not only the buildings themselves, but also the communities and neighborhoods that surrounded them. By the early 21st century, residents in Versailles, Vienna's Hietzing district, and the village of Schwangau near Neuschwanstein found themselves living beside monuments that drew millions of visitors annually, and the presence of mass tourism reshaped daily life, local economies, and the physical character of their surroundings. In these places and in parallel contexts, Rome, Montmartre in Paris, historic districts in Prague and Venice, residents and activists used a recurring term to describe what was happening to their neighborhoods: Disneyfication. The term carried multiple meanings, none of them complementary. At its simplest, it referred to the proliferation of souvenir shops, restaurants catering to tourists rather than locals, and infrastructure, parking lots, shuttle buses, visitor centers, designed to manage large crowds. In Schwangau, the approach roads to Neuschwanstein were lined with shops selling castle-themed merchandise, cafes offering standardized menus in multiple languages, and vendors hawking packaged experiences, carriage rides, tours, photo opportunities that transformed the Alpine village into an extension of the castle attraction. Local residents complained that housing costs had risen as properties were converted to short-term rentals, that traffic congestion made daily errands difficult, and that the village's identity had been subsumed into its role as service infrastructure for tourist flows. In Vienna, debates about Schönbrunns impact on surrounding neighborhoods focused less on overt commercialization. Austrian zoning regulations limited the most egregious forms of tourist sprawl than on subtler changes to the district's character. The palace drew visitors who often did not venture beyond the immediate vicinity, creating a localized zone of high tourist activity while leaving adjacent streets quieter and less affected. Yet, even this selective impact raised concerns. Residents noted that streets near the palace filled with tour buses idling while groups disembarked, that pedestrian routes to the palace became crowded during peak seasons, and that the presence of the palace as a major attraction influenced real estate prices and commercial development patterns across the district. In Versailles, the relationship between palace and town had always been intimate. The town existed because of the palace, and its economy had long depended on serving the needs of the court and, later, of visitors to the museum. But the scale of contemporary tourism strained that relationship. The town center is filled with restaurants and shops oriented toward day trippers who arrived by train from Paris, spent a few hours at the palace, and returned without engaging deeply with the town. Local activists and heritage professionals argued that this pattern of tourism turned living quarters into backdrops, valued primarily for their proximity to the attraction rather than as communities with their own histories and needs. These concerns echoed debates in other heavily visited heritage cities. Romans criticized the Disneyfication of the Eternal City, where historic piazzas had become stages for tourist performances, street vendors, costumed gladiators, selfie takers, and where the rhythms of local life were increasingly subordinated to the demands of the visitor economy. Parisians lamented that Montmartre had become a backdrop for visitors who come in express mode just to get a specific photo, a neighborhood reduced to a series of iconic views reproduced on social media and emptied of the complexity that characterized its history. Travel writers calling palaces like Neuschwanstein and Schönbrunn tourist traps reflected a public perception that experiences at these sites were staged and commodified, engineered for maximum commercial return rather than authentic engagement with place and history. The term Disneyfication invoked theme parks as a point of comparison, suggesting that heritage sites had adopted the operational logic of entertainment venues where every element was designed, scripted, and optimized for visitor satisfaction. Scholarly definitions emphasized the transformation of places into themed, commercially optimized spaces, often at the expense of local life and complex histories. The critique was not that tourists visited. Tourism had been part of these sites' reality for more than a century, but that the scale and intensity of contemporary tourism, combined with commercial pressures, had reached a point where the needs of residents and the integrity of the place were increasingly compromised. Street noise outside quiet palace parks, the hiss of bus hydraulics, shutters rattling in early mornings as deliveries arrived for souvenir shops. These acoustic intrusions marked the spillover of tourism into neighborhoods that had once been insulated from the palace's public role. The palace's chandeliers, carefully preserved inside, contrasted with neon signs and selfie sticks outside. The juxtaposition illustrated a fundamental tension. Heritage sites depended on tourism for their economic survival, but the infrastructure required to deliver and serve large numbers of visitors often degraded the very qualities, tranquility, authenticity, local character, that made the sites appealing in the first place. Residents of heritage-adjacent neighborhoods found themselves negotiating an ambivalent position. They benefited economically from tourism, property values rose, employment opportunities expanded, and local businesses thrived. But they also experienced costs that were less easily quantified: loss of community cohesion, erosion of local culture, and the sense that their neighborhoods were being reshaped by forces beyond their control. The palace survives as a brand. The neighborhood negotiates the cost of living beside it. In debates from Vienna to Paris, residents use the same word, Disneyfication, to name their fear that heritage has become a spectacle at their expense. In the years following the global financial crisis of 2008 and the subsequent expansion of social media platforms, heritage tourism entered a new phase characterized by the pursuit of the shareable image. Visitors to Versailles, Schönbrunn, and Neuschwanstein increasingly framed their experience around the production of photographs that could be posted, liked, and circulated through digital networks. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the Great Gallery at Schönbrunn, and the Throne Hall at Neuschwanstein became sites of performance, where tourists positioned themselves for selfies, waited in line for unobstructed shots of chandeliers and mirrors, and moved through the spaces with attention divided between direct observation and the mediation of screens. This shift in visitor behavior had practical consequences for site management. Palaces adjusted policies on photography, allowing it in some areas, restricting it in others, prohibiting flash to protect sensitive surfaces, and managed traffic flows to accommodate visitors who paused longer at photogenic locations. The experience of visiting these sites became inseparable from the desire to document and share that visit, to collect evidence of having been there, and to participate in a global circulation of images that both promoted and commodified heritage. Yet, even as these palaces adapted to contemporary modes of tourism, they remained fundamentally what they had always been: assemblages of stone, wood, glass, and metal, arranged according to principles of design, constructed by human labor, and subject to the physical processes of entropy that affect all material things. The chandeliers in these spaces, whether in the Hall of Mirrors, the Great Gallery, or the Throne Hall, continued to hang as they had for decades or centuries, their crystal drops refracting light, their metal frames supporting weight, their presence marking the passage of time through accumulated layers of maintenance, restoration, and adaptation. Curators handling fragments in storage rooms behind public galleries, a dismounted chandelier arm from Schönbrunn, a gilt bracket from Versailles, a copied motif from Neuschwanstein's Throne Hall, engaged in acts of preservation that extended beyond the merely technical. Each fragment was a bearer of history, a physical remnant of past intentions, aesthetic decisions, and social relations. The decision to preserve these fragments, to catalog them, to store them in climate-controlled environments, reflected a contemporary commitment to the idea that the past should be accessible to the future, that objects carried meanings worth protecting, even when those meanings had become detached from original contexts. UNESCO statements and management plans framed these palaces as cultural landscapes and dreams in stone, whose preservation now depended on global recognition and careful tourism management. The language was aspirational, suggesting that heritage transcended national boundaries and belonged to humanity as a collective, but it also acknowledged the practical reality that preservation required resources, financial, technical, human, that could be mobilized only through a combination of public support and revenue generated by visitor access. Some chandeliers still hung where they were first installed. Others were replicas, the originals resting in controlled environments where temperature, humidity, and light exposure were monitored continuously. The distinction between original and reproduction mattered to conservators and historians who tracked provenance and documented alterations. But for many visitors, the distinction was invisible and irrelevant. What mattered was the aesthetic effect, the impression of grandeur and historical depth, the sense of standing in a space that had witnessed events and hosted figures, now remote in time. Whether the chandelier overhead was the one installed in 1684 or a careful reconstruction made in 1975 did not alter the visitor's encounter with the space, though it changed the object's status within scholarly and curatorial discourse. The muffled quiet of closed galleries after hours, the faint hum of dehumidifiers maintaining stable conditions, the soft clink of crystal as a chandelier settled when the last visitor left. These moments belong to the palace's nocturnal life, a time when the buildings rested between performances, when maintenance staff moved through empty rooms, and when the architecture existed without the overlay of visitor interpretation and expectation. The narrator threads together the three stories. Once instruments of sovereign light, these chandeliers now illuminate cues, audio guides, and special access tours. The palaces themselves have survived revolutions, wars, and the end of the families that built them, but only by accepting a new role as curated experiences. Architecture, here, is no longer the language of command but of memory. It does not rule, it receives. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, long after closing, a single maintenance lamp shines through the crystal of one chandelier. Outside, souvenir bags rustle as visitors board late trains toward Paris. Inside, the light traces the same path along marble and mirror that royal candles once followed in 1684. No longer proclaiming a living power, only illuminating the fact that it has passed. The chandeliers were designed to multiply the king's presence through reflection, to turn light into political theater, to make radiance an attribute of sovereignty. Now they multiply only their own image, refracted in glass and captured in photographs, symbols whose referent has disappeared, but whose aesthetic force persists. Every palace built to outlast its age now depends on that age's descendants buying tickets. The stone survives, but only as long as we still wish to visit the idea of power.